you seriously that desperate?
Howdy there, friends, family, adversaries, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary folks. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Riley Constantine, aka Biological Riley, and today we are talking about Final Fantasy VII Remake. In fact, today's episode is a review of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Who knew? Only one thing to note before we get started with this review is that there will be spoilers eventually in the video. It won't be till towards the end, but I'll let you know when those spoilers happen because some aspects of Final Fantasy VII Remake can't be discussed without addressing some spoilers. So, with that, on to the video. Final Fantasy VII Remake juggles more emotions than a depressed clown. In an early scene, the game establishes itself as a silly fantasy story with deep emotional depth that's simultaneously humorous, heartfelt, and dead serious. In this sequence, the moody mercenary Cloud Strife enters a bar owned by his childhood best friend Tifa. However, this isn't just a friendly visit. Cloud did a dangerous job for Tifa's friend Barrett, the leader of the eco-terrorist freedom-fighting organization Avalanche, and is looking to get paid the 1500 gil, i.e. Final Fantasy VII Remake's currency, that he's owed. Before the scene becomes too serious, though, it turns comedic as Cloud is sidelined by a distrustful Barrett who goes into a meeting with his Avalanche cohorts underneath the bar that's accessed by a secret elevator obscured by a pinball machine. To bide the time, Tifa mixes Cloud a couple drinks in a sequence that is both humorous in its action and informative, allowing the player to catch a glimpse of Cloud's and Tifa's friendship. It's a scene that inspires the player to open their eyes and wonder, gaze up into the sky, and exclaim, "What the f***?" The bar sequence is a great scene with many layers. Whether due to the more silly elements or the more dramatic tidbits inherent to this scene, the player cannot help but to be drawn into this scene and by extension the rest of the game. Every aspect of Final Fantasy VII Remake is as bizarre yet wonderful as this bar sequence. Rather than be put off, I was always intrigued by the game's oddball nature, and I always wanted to see what would happen next. Speaking for myself, someone who had never played the original Final Fantasy VII, I was shocked by how drawn I was to the world of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Whether it was the narrative intricacies, fun gameplay sequences, great cutscenes, and an odd yet wonderful sense of humor, I was fully engaged with this reimagining of Square Enix's turn-based RPG classic, despite the game's approximate 35-hour playtime. Yeah, it's a long game, especially considering this is a part 1 of a many-part series, but it's also just really damn good. Final Fantasy VII Remake's story befits this inherently bizarre yet sincere game. The title is a reimagining of Square Enix's 1997 turn-based RPG classic, and from what I understand from those who've played the original, Final Fantasy VII Remake takes a fair few artistic liberties. The plot follows Cloud Strife and the environmental freedom fighters Avalanche as they battle Shinra, a ruthless organization that doubles as an energy corporation and a government. The game takes place in the Shinra capital city of Midgar, and on Midgar, people are distinctly categorized into the haves and have-nots by design. Midgar is a massive metropolis where big money is made and spent, but built beneath the skyscrapers and obscene ostentatious decadence, the poor live in slums, buried beneath the gaudy Shinra elite. Avalanche's goal is to strike back at Shinra for various injustices, particularly Shinra's avaricious fuel consumption of Mako energy, basically magic fossil fuel that's killing the planet. How relevant! The story is very political by design. The original Final Fantasy VII was notoriously heavy on environmentalism, and with Final Fantasy VII Remake, this tale about corporate greed and rapacious fuel consumption hits just as well today. After all, the real world is currently barreling full speed ahead into our own self-inflicted climate change apocalypse, and reflecting that, this game still feels relevant. Whenever Barrett or other members of the activist freedom fighter group Avalanche discuss taking the fight to their Shinra corporate overlords, the delivery comes across as relevant, albeit with a flair of charming silliness. The silliness works as a form of comedic relief, ensuring that Final Fantasy VII Remake, as sincere as it is about its political leanings, doesn't become too dour. In fact, I don't care how seriously you take this story, there are some just absolutely bonkers sections of this game that just, you can't help but to crack a smile at them. Like this. See what I mean? However, Final Fantasy VII Remake's greatest storytelling attribute is its character development. Whether it's the mysterious Cloud, the Disney princess-esque Aerith, the friendly Tifa, or the ass-kicking Barret, the characters and their interpersonal drama work well here. The way in which these big personalities interact is always a thrill, and during my playtime, my emotions ranged from laughing out loud from a quip by Barret, joy from seeing Cloud cross-dress, laser-focused concentration when the narrative became intense, and teary-eyed sadness during Final Fantasy VII Remake's more somber moments. Even during its most ridiculous moments, Final Fantasy VII Remake sticks the landing with every emotion it's trying to convey, and it's really great in this regard. The main protagonist, Cloud Strife, is the most notable of these character dramas. At first, Cloud is kind of a major dick, but then you realize that his tough guy persona is just an act. Deep down, he is in emotional anguish for various reasons, and he's afraid of people seeing him vulnerable. Even though Cloud struggles to maintain his brick wall facade at times, Cloud never allows his closest friends and acquaintances to see him in pain, lest they believe he's weak. Cloud's character arc speaks to the wrong masculine notion that displaying one's personal feelings is a moral failing, and throughout the game, Cloud slowly but surely learns that it's okay to be emotionally close to people he trusts. It's a good lesson that more folk in the real world need to heed, and makes for a strong character arc in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Also, another reason why I really like Cloud is his hair. I know it sounds basic, but put me in the military and call me Captain Fabulous because his hair is just so well coiffed that I'm jealous. Final Fantasy VII Remake's gameplay complements the interpersonal character development. Echoing the character growth, Final Fantasy VII Remake's squad-based combat allows the player to further connect with these characters. Amid the action, the player can switch and control different party members with various strengths and weaknesses that fit these characters. The playable characters include the skilled ex-soldier Cloud, who specializes in sword-based combat, the hot-headed Barret, who has a Gatling gun for an arm that's useful for ranged attacks, the up-close and personal Tifa, who pummels people with her bare hands, and the support character Aerith, who wields both offensive and defensive magic. Whether fighting humans, robots, monsters, trash goblins, or bosses, the abilities of Final Fantasy VII Remake's various squad members befit the characters using them. In other words, it's a form of character development through player-game interaction that works incredibly well in terms of convincing the player to care about the story and the action. Which is a very important thing. Looking at you, Anthem. Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat additionally fires on all cylinders. Even if Final Fantasy VII Remake had a horrible story, it doesn't, but humor me, okay? The game would still be salvageable due to the overhauled combat. Compared to the original Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Remake's fighting mechanics are a great marriage of old school and newly minted game design. The game's combat combines real-time action and turn-based strategy, and while this sounds like it'd feel disjointed, the action feels fluid without sacrificing the strategy elements the original was known for. This will take a bit of explaining, but I promise the information dump will be worth it. In fluid action, each character contains a variety of light and heavy attacks, but utilizing the action time battle or ATB gauge really kicks the combat into high gear. All the characters have an ATB gauge that fills up when attacking or blocking, and upon starting every combat encounter, the gauge begins at 0. Once earned, ATB points allow the player to slow down time and input specific commands like special attacks, spells, and items. Despite the odds, the ATB system works in cohesion with the real-time combat. While pausing the combat in mid-fight might seem like it would break Final Fantasy VII Remake's gameplay flow, the ATB gauge functions seamlessly with the on-screen action. There is a ton of variety when fighting. Timing attacks, the ATB special abilities, and switching characters on the fly need to be done in a thoughtful and strategic manner in order for you to succeed. To be honest, it's quite a thrill. The gameplay is incredibly rewarding. The player has to manage their party with tact in order to survive the onslaught of monsters, bosses, and Shinra heavyweights. While I died a lot during my 35-hour playthrough, Final Fantasy VII Remake rarely felt frustrating, and I never believed the game was at fault for my strategic failures. When receiving the game over screen, I reassessed my approach to these given combat scenarios and made adjustments based on my past losses. As a result of eventually always proving victorious, the game's challenge was surmountable even if the odds felt stacked against the player at times. Final Fantasy VII Remake struck a good balance between being difficult and being fun, and due to this, the game is such a damn joy to play. My only real gripe with the combat is that sometimes the camera and lock-on feature doesn't work as intended. Sometimes the camera gets a little skewed, but that's a really minor flaw in comparison to how great everything else is. Admittedly, Final Fantasy VII Remake contains more faults than just a somewhat inconsistent camera. In terms of gameplay, I wish that the title would have emphasized experimentation in combat a bit more. Throughout the game, the player earns new weapons, but aside from a few instances, I generally stuck with the base weaponry. It's a similar problem that I had with God of War 2 back in the day. I didn't feel encouraged to try out different attack styles, weapons, or spells that went outside my comfort zone. Maybe the way in which you level up and upgrade your weapons threw me off, but I just didn't feel like experimenting with all the gear that I accrued during my playthrough. Unlike my college days, I was not very adventurous. I don't know why I put this in the script. Sorry. Final Fantasy VII Remake's length is another issue. This game is long, almost punishingly so at 35 hours. While I have played games longer than Final Fantasy VII Remake, this title contains way too much filler to justify its runtime. Especially during sections with tacked-on side quests, the narrative momentum screeches to a dead halt so that the player can help a kid find his cats or speak to a child vendor dressed as a mouse. It's downright infuriating, and during these sequences, I just wanted the game to get back to the good stuff. The game being a part 1 of a planned series only makes matters worse. Despite being a long title, Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't feel complete. While I understand that the game has more story to tell, too much of Final Fantasy VII Remake is unresolved. As someone who hadn't played the original game, I never learned about Cloud's trauma or why he hates Sephiroth so much. These questions are just left dangling in the air like narrative dingleberries without resolution, and it's disappointing. However, there is one part of Final Fantasy VII Remake that remains more controversial: its ending. So now is the part where I must spoil some aspects of the game, because in order to talk about the ending and why it's either a good or a bad thing, it has to be spoiled to some extent. So if you made it this far into the video and want to remain unspoiled to the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I suggest you turn off the video now and come back to it later, please, because I'm about to drop some spoilers. This is your last warning. For realsies. Final Fantasy VII Remake's most contentious issue is its ending. In fact, and I'll try to remain as vague as possible, Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending comes dangerously close to cultural blasphemy. Even though the term blasphemy is usually reserved for those who speak sacrilegiously of specific faiths, this descriptor can easily be attached to Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending as well. The game walks the line between being creatively bold and blasphemous when compared to the beloved original. While Final Fantasy VII Remake remains faithful to the original in many respects, Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending differentiates itself from the source material in some key areas, and even becomes a meta-commentary on the nature of video game remakes in the original Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't content to rehash the classic 1997 game verbatim, and riskily deviates from the original in order to keep knowledgeable players on their toes, using their knowledge of the original game against them. The ending is brilliant, I think. However, these deviations only work if you've played the original Final Fantasy VII. Meta commentary can only function if you know the source commentary, and as someone who had never played Final Fantasy VII before, I did not understand the significance of what Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending was aiming for in its lore changes, because I have little to no knowledge of Final Fantasy VII's lore. To someone who hasn't experienced the original, Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending is near nonsensical. Admittedly, I at first hated the ending because I didn't know what the was going on, but after doing some research, I kind of actually really respect Square Enix's bold strategy to alter the lore. Video game remakes have two audiences: old players with major nostalgia and curious newcomers, yet Final Fantasy VII Remake is potentially alienating to both of those target customers. At risk of infuriating old fans and confusing new ones like myself, Final Fantasy VII Remake makes an artistic statement, and while it's debatable whether or not the game stuck the landing, I still respect the hell out of Square Enix's creative decision here, even though I was perplexed by the time the credits rolled. Potentially angering old fans and confusing new ones. Don't know if that's a great strategy in the long run, but it sure as hell was bold. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a weird acid trip of a video game that's both fun to play and a joy to experience. While it is overly long, has too many unresolved plot lines, and contains a controversial ending, Final Fantasy VII Remake deserves to be played. The modernized battle system is great, and the story, as goofy as it is terrific. I love these characters in this detail-rich world, and I'm looking forward to returning to Final Fantasy VII Remake whenever Part 2 eventually releases. Let's hope we don't have to wait too long for that though. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating and subscribe to my channel. The more likes and subscribers I get helps with YouTube's algorithm and helps show that people enjoy this style of content. Also, please leave me a comment telling me what you thought of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Please refrain from spoilers though. Additionally, if you really liked this video, consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar helps keep this show going and improving it. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my high tier patrons, Slasher Bales, Mom, Miles Nelson, and David Devlin. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.